The apartment had never looked so full and so empty at the same time. Aisha had decorated it herself that morning. White balloons tied to the kitchen chairs, a modest bunch of lilies on the dining table, a store-bought cake with blue icing that read, "Congratulations, Doctor," in slightly uneven letters. She'd laughed when she bought it, texting Daniel a photo. They spelled my name wrong on the first try. He'd texted back a laughing emoji and then, an hour later, showed up with the corrected version, having sweet-talked the bakery into redoing it at no charge. That was Daniel. He had always been the kind of man who quietly fixed things. He stood near the window now, in a button-down she'd ironed for him that same morning, one of the last ordinary things she would ever do for him, watching the city below with a soft, private smile. He looked genuinely happy. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. She had expected him to sense it, the way partners sometimes do when something enormous is about to shift. But Daniel just stood there, relaxed and warm, entirely unaware. Aisha touched the lapel of her white coat. Her name was stitched in blue thread over the breast pocket. Dr. Aisha Rahman. She had imagined this moment for so many years that she thought she'd cry when it finally arrived. Instead, she felt something strange and clear-edged, like the world had snapped into focus and she was seeing it, perhaps for the first time, without sentiment. "You look like you're about to perform surgery on the mirror," Daniel said, coming to stand behind her. She met his eyes in the reflection. "I'm just taking it in." "Take it in fast. My mother calls in 10 minutes and she'll want to talk to the doctor, not the daydreamer." She smiled. It cost her something. They had met in the third year of university, in a cafeteria queue during a particularly grim stretch of November. Daniel was studying civil engineering. Aisha was pre-med, already exhausted in the way that only first-generation strivers truly understand. The bone-deep tiredness of carrying not just your own ambition, but everyone who came before you. He had offered her the last cheese sandwich on the shelf with a completely straight face and said, "You look like you need this more than I do." She had been too hungry and too tired to be charmed and had simply taken it. He'd found that hilarious. She'd found him persistent. They were a slow burn. Careful, even at the beginning. Two practical people who understood, without ever quite saying it, that love was not something to be careless with. By the time they married, 4 years later, it felt less like a leap of faith and more like the natural conclusion of a long, honest conversation. The years that followed were genuinely hard. Medical school was not an abstraction. It was tuition fees that arrived like clockwork, textbooks that cost more than a week of groceries, rotations that swallowed her whole for weeks at a time. Daniel worked. He worked more than she ever fully registered, because he was quiet about it in the way that capable people often are. He picked up additional shifts at the engineering firm that had hired him straight out of his degree. He managed their finances with a spreadsheet he updated every Sunday evening, color-coded, meticulous. When her student loan deferment required a financial cosigner, he signed without hesitation. When she was 2 weeks from a major licensing exam and barely sleeping, he made dinner every night and left it covered on the stove without asking for acknowledgement, because he understood that acknowledgement was a luxury she didn't have the bandwidth for. He did these things because he loved her, but he also did them because he believed in the project of them, the long shared project of building a life together. He had, in that way, made a very large and very human error. He had assumed that because he understood the terms of their partnership, she understood them too. The envelope was in her coat pocket. She'd had it drafted 3 days earlier, had told no one. She waited until the last guest left, Daniel's sister, who hugged Aisha for a long time at the door and said, "We're so proud of you." And then she waited a little longer, until the apartment was quiet and the city outside had softened into evening. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. Daniel was in the kitchen, wrapping leftover cake. He looked up, reading her tone immediately. He set down the plastic wrap. "Okay." She placed the envelope on the table between them. He looked at it for a moment before picking it up. When he opened it and began to read, his expression didn't collapse the way she'd half expected. It went very still. That was worse. "This is a divorce petition," he said. "Yes." "You filed it." 3 days ago. He put the papers down carefully, the way you put down something fragile, even when you're angry. He pulled out a chair and sat. She remained standing. "Will you tell me why?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort it cost him. She had rehearsed this. She'd practiced it in the car, in the hospital bathroom between shifts, in the quiet moments before sleep. She had a version that was compassionate and one that was direct, and standing here now, she found she could only manage the direct one. "I've been thinking about this for a while, about where my life is going and what I need. I'm entering a different world now, professionally, socially. I've grown into someone different." She paused. "I don't think we want the same things anymore." "I want you," he said simply. "I've always wanted you." "That's not enough on its own." Something crossed his face. "Since when?" "Daniel." "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "Tell me honestly, is there someone else?" "No." "Then what? You've outgrown me? Is that what this is?" She looked at the table. "I didn't say that." "You implied it." She didn't deny it, and the silence was its own answer. He sat with it for a long moment. "I put you through school," he finally said. Not as an accusation, more like a man who has just found something he'd mislaid and is turning it over in his hands, trying to understand how it got there. "I know what you did." "Do you?" What she didn't know, what she learned later through her solicitor, was that Daniel had, throughout their marriage, kept careful records. This was not the act of a suspicious man. It was the habit of an engineer. Document everything, keep receipts, create a paper trail, because a paper trail is what protects you when memory fails or intentions are disputed. He had not kept those records with any adversarial purpose. He had kept them the way he kept the color-coded spreadsheet, because it was how his mind worked, because order was how he expressed care. But when the divorce proceedings began in earnest, those records became something else entirely. Their solicitors negotiated for several weeks. There was a financial support agreement they had signed jointly during her 3rd year of medical school, a straightforward document drawn up at the suggestion of the loan deferral officer that outlined the terms of Daniel's co-signed financial contributions in the event of a significant change in circumstance. At the time, Aisha had read it and signed it without much thought. It had seemed like a formality. It had not been a formality. The settlement was not dramatic. There were no courtroom speeches. A judge reviewed the documentation in a civil hearing that lasted under 2 hours, and the ruling was calm and procedural. Daniel was entitled to a financial recognition of his contributions, structured as a fixed settlement sum and a modest, time-limited percentage of her future earnings for a defined period. Her solicitor called it fair. Aisha called it humiliating, privately, and said nothing publicly, because she was beginning to understand that dignity in this situation required her to say very little. She moved into a new apartment on the other side of the city, modern, quiet, with large windows and views of rooftops stretching into the distance. She told herself she liked the silence. Daniel went back to school. He had always meant to complete a postgraduate qualification, had set it aside during the years of supporting her. Now, with part of the settlement invested sensibly and a clearer sense of what his time was worth, he enrolled in a part-time business management program at the university where they'd first met. He was older than most of his cohort. He didn't mind. He liked the work. He liked, more than he expected, the particular freedom of building something entirely his own. He met Priya in the 2nd semester. She was a lecturer in organizational behavior, steady, straightforward, with a dry sense of humor and no patience for pretense. She did not need rescuing. She was not a project. She was simply a person who liked him, and whom he liked back, and there was something quietly extraordinary about how uncomplicated that felt. They took it slowly. He was honest with her from the beginning. He was recently divorced, still finding his footing, not entirely sure what he was capable of yet. She appreciated the honesty more than she let on. They had dinner. They argued about films. She corrected his grammar in text messages, and he found it endearing rather than irritating, which struck him as a good sign. Ayesha ran into him at a conference, of all places, a healthcare and infrastructure forum, the kind of cross-sector event neither of them would have attended 5 years ago. She saw him before he saw her. He was talking to someone near the registration desk, laughing at something the other person had said, and he looked at ease in a way that made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't entirely name. He noticed her a moment later. "Ayesha," he said. Warm, unhurried. "Daniel." She glanced at his lanyard. He was there representing a small infrastructure consultancy, his name listed as a project associate, which meant he'd moved up. "You look well." "I am well," he said, and the absence of qualification in that statement, no considering everything, no weighted pause, told her more than she wanted to know. They talked for a few minutes, politely, even kindly. He asked about her work. She told him about a research project she was contributing to. She asked about his degree. He said he was nearly finished. There was a natural lull, and she almost let it pass. "I think about what happened," she said. "Sometimes." He looked at her steadily. "So do I." "I handled it badly." "Yes," he agreed, without cruelty and without absolution, just the plain fact of it. "I thought success meant something specific," she said. "I had this idea of what my life was supposed to look like once I got there, and I think I convinced myself you weren't part of that picture." She paused. "I was wrong." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Around them, the conference murmured on. "I don't think you were wrong that we'd grown differently," he said finally. "I think you were wrong about what to do with that." He considered his next words. "We could have talked. We could have figured out what we both actually needed. Instead, you made a decision alone and handed me the result." He said it without heat. "That's what I couldn't forgive. Not the leaving, the way you left." She nodded. Her eyes were dry, but only just. "Are you happy?" she asked. He considered it honestly, the way he'd always considered things. "I'm getting there," he said. "Yeah, I think I am." A woman appeared at his elbow then, confident, warm-eyed, squeezing his arm briefly as she handed him a coffee. He introduced her. "Priya." The name landed gently, without drama. Ayesha shook her hand, said something appropriate. Priya was kind without being curious, which Ayesha recognized as a particular kind of grace. They parted with a nod. She watched him walk away, back into the crowd, back into his life, which was full and moving and no longer hers. She didn't collapse. She was not that kind of woman. She went back to her table, poured herself a glass of water, and sat for a moment with the feeling. Not grief exactly, more like the recognition of a cost that had been incurred a long time ago and was only now fully tallied. She thought about what he had said, not the leaving, the way you left. She had been so certain, in those weeks before the divorce, that she was making a clear-eyed decision. And in some ways, she had been. She had genuinely changed. She genuinely needed something different. But clear-eyed decisions could still be cruel ones, and she had confused efficiency with honesty, speed with courage. She had handed him an envelope instead of a conversation. She had treated 8 years of partnership as a phase to be concluded rather than a history to be honored. Those were not the mistakes of ambition. They were the mistakes of fear. Fear that if she stopped long enough to explain herself, she would lose the nerve entirely. Fear that he would talk her out of it, or worse, that he would deserve to. She thought about the bracelet. 8 years. Always. She still had it. She didn't know why she'd kept it. perhaps because it was the last thing he'd given her with no motive behind it except love, and she understood now that such things were rarer than she had known. Ayesha built a good life. Her research was published. Her patients trusted her. She learned, over time, to be more honest, with colleagues, with the few people she let close, with herself. She did not meet someone new for a long while, and when she eventually did, she was slower about it, more careful, more willing to sit in discomfort rather than resolve it unilaterally. She was not unhappy, but she carried the lesson the way you carry a scar. Not always visible, not always painful, but permanent. A reminder of the shape of a wound you'd once inflicted, and the particular kind of loss that comes not from tragedy, but from a choice you can't take back. Daniel and Priya moved in together the following spring. He finished his degree. He took a position he was proud of. On evenings when he cooked dinner, and she read at the kitchen table, and the apartment was full of ordinary, unspectacular peace, he sometimes thought about the long road that had brought him here, the warehouse shifts, the spreadsheets, the courtroom, the bookstores and conference halls, and the gradual, effortful work of becoming himself again. He thought about it without bitterness. It had cost him a great deal. But cost was not the same as waste, and loss was not the same as failure. He had loved fully and been abandoned, and had survived it, and had rebuilt. There was something worth knowing in that, something he carried quietly, the way he carried most important things. He poured 2 glasses of wine, called Priya's name from the kitchen. And she came.